90% of Soviet people thought they were living in the best country in the world. But during those same years, thousands of people were homeless. Food was rationed, and even workers were skipping out on their jobs. So how is it possible that in a country that was the world's second largest economy at the time, people were sleeping in parked train cars? Today, we want to explore this very mystery and talk about the man who, with his calm demeanor and his remarkably dry speeches, led such a great nation into a deep and endless slumber. Alright, let's get into today's video. In 1964, Nikita Khrushchev, the boisterous leader of the Soviet Union who had alienated everyone with his overly aggressive reforms and dictatorial attitude, had just been removed from power. The Communist Party was looking for a calmer, more orderly, and of course, more obedient leader. Then, a man with thick eyebrows, a calm gaze, and a smile that always seemed half-finished stepped in. That man's name was Leonid Brezhnev. Interestingly, Khrushchev was overthrown in a bloodless coup orchestrated by Brezhnev. However, Brezhnev didn't allow Khrushchev to be put on trial or even humiliated. Brezhnev was known as a friendly person who got along with everyone, even his opponents. In the following years, whenever he dismissed someone, he allowed them to retire with respect. Something that was absolutely impossible during Stalin's era. After decades of war, famine, and violence, Brezhnev wanted to turn the Soviet Union into a stable country for the first time. In other words, when Brezhnev took power in the Soviet Union in 1964, the country was deeply in crisis. Decades of economic turmoil, famine, state-sponsored terror campaigns, and the most devastating war in history had brought the Soviet Union to its knees. Unlike previous leaders who sought major revolutions and fundamental changes, Brezhnev pursued a set of very realistic goals. Stability and economic prosperity for all Soviet people. But Brezhnev didn't really seem like a political player. He liked to talk about luxury cars, collect medals, and sometimes even doze off in the middle of speeches. It's true that in the final years of his rule, especially after 1976, Brezhnev suffered from a lot of physical and mental health problems. Problems like minor strokes, memory loss, speech disorders, and even hand tremors. Because of these problems, sometimes during official meetings or Communist Party speeches, he would look completely confused or drowsy, whether he was speaking himself or while others were talking. His dozing off became so well known that later on, it was even mentioned in satirical shows, stories about dictators, and the memoirs of some party members. Now, let's take a closer look at Brezhnev's time in power. Let's go back a little bit. In the early years, everything seemed to be going well. From 1964 to the early 1970s, per capita income grew. That means it increased by about 3.5% per year, plus household consumption went up to 70%. People got better homes, salaries increased, and even having a refrigerator or a TV was no longer considered a big deal. All of this happened during the Kosygin reforms. In fact, Alexei Kosygin was Brezhnev's right-hand man when it came to the economy, and he wanted to make the Soviet Union a bit more market-oriented. That's why factory owners were allowed to decide for themselves what to produce, instead of just following orders from above. But where was the problem? It was that no one was allowed to be too successful. This meant that if a factory owner produced too much in one year, their budget for the next year would be reduced. Because the assumption was that a factory owner who spent less didn't need a bigger budget. But what was the result of this? Everyone learned to produce only as much as the target required. No more, no less. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union spent billions of dollars on agriculture. In 1981 alone, $33 billion was spent on farmland. But why were people still hungry? The reason was very simple. The agricultural system was still operating with the same methods from the 1930s. That is, Without motivation, without expertise, full of machinery that wasn't at all suitable for small plots of land, and with collective farms that were called kolkhoz. Kolkhoz is a Russian term, and its goal was to eliminate private land ownership and make agriculture nationalized and collective. This meant that farmers worked together collectively on the farms, but the land was no longer theirs. On the surface, this method was supposed to bring about justice, but in practice, productivity declined. Motivation disappeared, famine and food shortages increased, and farmers became more like soulless, forced laborers. Now, in the midst of all this, some kolkhozes were allowed to give a small portion of land to farmers as private gardens, and this tiny piece of land provided up to 30% of the country's food production. Many people asked, if it's so productive, why not privatize the whole system? But Brezhnev was not willing to back down from communist ideology, even when he realized that famine was returning. This is where the metaphor of the green crisis can be used for this situation. Meaning, the fields were green. A lot of investment was made in agriculture, but still, production wasn't enough and the food crisis continued. But starting from the second half of Brezhnev's rule, that is, roughly the years when Brezhnev wasn't in good health and spent most of his time receiving medals and reading pre-written speeches, the Soviet economy gradually entered a period of deep stagnation. At the same time, it seemed like people had lost their motivation. Workers were looking for ways to avoid work. Students knew that no matter what grades they got, there would always be a place for them somewhere in the system. Incompetent managers kept their positions because there was no such thing as getting fired. Brezhnev, instead of reforming the system, decided to keep people entertained with social benefits. For example, they built houses that were considered acceptable by the standards of that time. Of course, each person only had 13 square meters of living space. Or, for instance, exemplary workers, those who were seen as role models, worked with motivation, followed the system's ideology, and, in a word, were highly productive, were rewarded with vacations in Georgia. In fact, when it came to the economy, Brezhnev believed that if people were to truly embrace communism, they needed to achieve a certain level of welfare. That's why he required industries to produce consumer goods like cars, and he began mass construction of apartments for the people. His slogan was that every Soviet family has the right to own a home and a car. By granting certain privileges to ordinary people and the middle class, he tried to prevent social discontent. For example, he kept the prices of essential goods low, provided affordable housing to the people, and made sure that dissatisfaction didn't become public. However, public services had declined nonetheless. The hospitals were run down. Medicine had become scarce, and in some cities, bread and sugar rationing had started again. But this was just the beginning. The Soviet Union was gradually approaching the era of its collapse. The 1970s were a significant period for the Soviet Union. Outwardly, the Soviet Union appeared strong. It was still ahead of the United States in the production of steel, tractors, and oil. In fact, during the 1970s, when global oil prices rose, the Soviet Union made a lot of money. But instead of using this money to reform the economic structure, they continued with the same old system and spent most of it on war and heavy industry. As a result, the Soviet economic system, which was highly dependent on oil and gas sales, took a major hit a decade later in the 1980s when oil prices dropped. Consequently, even on the surface, the Soviet Union no longer seemed as strong because that economic growth didn't continue and the economic and political foundations of the country began to shake. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the technological gap between the Soviet Union and the West had become alarmingly wide, especially in computers. Then, when the United States revolutionized the world with IBM 360 computers, Brezhnev decided that the entire Soviet computer industry should copy the IBM 360. But the problem was that the hardware built to resemble the IBM 360 was low quality and produced in limited quantities. Most importantly, innovation disappeared because they were only focused on copying. As a result, the Soviet Union was never able to catch up with the West in the computer race and was forced to resort to smuggling technology from the West. In short, a country that once prided itself on its nuclear and atomic energy achievements had now reached a point where it was chasing after reverse engineering Western components. On top of that, Brezhnev wasn't much of a risk taker. He mostly tried to maintain the status quo, but these policies didn't yield good results in the long run. Inside the country, dissatisfaction was also on the rise. People were tired of long lines to buy goods, shortages of basic necessities, and government corruption. But since there was no freedom of speech, no one dared to speak out loud. Even Brezhnev himself was no longer as active as before. From the late 70s, his health started to deteriorate. He spent most of his time at his private villa or in ceremonial meetings, and in practice, the country was being run by a group of old, conservative advisors who were unwilling to make any changes. In fact, the structure of the country had turned into a gerontocracy, a place where elderly people stayed in power for decades, and there was no room for new ideas. As a result, in a country where young people were pursuing science and technology at universities, in reality, these young people and their creative ideas had no place in the system, because the highest decisions were being made by people who didn't even know the difference between a computer and a typewriter. The outcome was a closed environment, without ideas, without risk, and without hope for the future. But maybe what really put the final nail in the Soviet Union's coffin was a decision made in the winter of 1979. The Soviets decided to go to war with Afghanistan, a country that had no infrastructure, no army, and no stable government. Brezhnev thought that with a quick operation, he could install a pro-Soviet government and wrap everything up. But this war dragged on for years. Thousands of soldiers lost their lives and a huge amount of money was spent. All this at a time when people were standing in line for butter and sugar. This war not only drained the Soviet Union financially and in terms of human lives, but also ruined its international reputation. On top of that, many countries, especially in the Islamic world, condemned the Soviet Union for occupying Afghanistan. In short, this issue also played a major role in the Soviet Union's decline. When we were researching Brezhnev's era to make this video, we had mixed feelings. On one hand, you see that the Soviet Union genuinely wanted to create a better life for its people. That's why they built housing, provided subsidies, and arranged holidays for them. But on the other hand, this very government, with its hesitation and stubbornness, blocked any real innovation or reform. Honestly, I think when a system becomes content with stagnation or repetition, even the strongest ones eventually fall. What do you think? Do you think if Brezhnev had taken reforms seriously, or if Kosygin had more power and his reforms were fully implemented, the Soviet Union could have been saved, or was its collapse inevitable? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. At the same time, many people praise Brezhnev for being able to bring a certain level of stability to the country. But at the same time, they criticize him because that stability later turned into stagnation and many of his achievements were lost. Some historians say that during his era, the Soviet Union became a true superpower, but on the other hand, they also say that it was during that same period that the collapse of the Soviet system began. And in fact, less than 10 years after Brezhnev's death, the Soviet Union fell apart, and the communist governments of Eastern Europe collapsed one after another. In short, with his policy of stability at any cost, Brezhnev created a calm period and a long stagnation for the Soviet Union. But what was the price? A gradual loss of public trust, the collapse of innovation, and ultimately, the death of the system. The Soviet Union didn't collapse under Brezhnev. It just quietly sat down, it closed its eyes, and went to sleep. But that sleep never had an awakening. You could say that during that era of sleepy leadership, the seeds of the Soviet Union's future collapse were sown. And it's as if Brezhnev's short naps led the Soviet Union into an eternal nightmare.